Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. I'm a few minutes early. We'll give everyone another couple of minutes before we get started. Hi, Erin. Good to see you. Hello, Luis. Good to see you as well. Oh, great. Thank you, Six Cats Press. I appreciate that. Also, thank you so much for being the moderator today. I really appreciate that. Um, I know I'm live, but I'm just going to go ahead and share that I panicked here a few minutes before I got started because I couldn't remember how to go live with a pre-scheduled. Um, so it took me a few minutes and a little bit of Google searches. So I'm much better at editing than I am at technology. So also, Kay, thank you also for agreeing to help with the moderation today. You all make this conference so easy for presenters. I really appreciate it. Hi, author Kay McCoy. Thanks for joining us as well. I know the speakers this year, speakers every year are wonderful, but the presentations this year have been phenomenal. I'm very honored to be a part of the group. Dreaming Truth author. Hello. I love to see everyone's handles. I think that's what they're called. Again, not a tech person, editing person. But I love to see like how everybody identifies themselves. I think that's fantastic. All right, my clock says 4 o'clock. So in the interest of keeping everything moving, I will go ahead and get started. Again, thank you everyone who has joined. I apologize if you joined and I didn't give you a specific shout out. I am really pleased that you are here and that you're interested in the self-editing mindset. Um, so my name is Laura Hum and I use she, her pronouns. And in my off time, I am a developmental editor. I've done about 150 editing sessions with probably over 1,000 chapters reviewed. During those editing sessions, I help authors focus on cast, characters, story, and voice, both voice of their characters and their own author voice. During my day job, I'm a training designer. I've been doing it for more than 20 years and I've designed over 100 interactive trainings, most of which are related to communication and the way people talk to each other and interact. So when my colleague and friend, Jeff Elkins, started the Dialogue Doctor about 5 years ago and asked me to go on this journey with him, I thought, um, I've done some editing, mostly technical and copy editing, but never from a fiction place. But since I was editing his books for him and he thought I had something to say that was worth hearing, I was excited to jump into the venture with him. And since then, I've been able to take that developmental editing and that training designer background and pull them together to be a writing coach. F- as a coach, I've created courses and workshops like this. We've done a couple of multi-day workshops. We do a dialogue dash a couple times a year where we bring the community together and everybody kind of works on their own story, but the camaraderie of working together and collaborating alongside each other really helps boost motivation. And I've co-authored a couple workbooks with Jeff Elkins and JP Reinflesch the ninth. I never remember what his ninth is at the end. So sorry about that, JP. But I also get the opportunity to work one on one with authors who are putting together a story but aren't really sure how to make that work. So by the time an author gets to me, they've done a ton of self editing, but they bring their work to me and they say things like, I'm just having a hard time finding new ideas. Every time I do an edit, I feel like I'm moving further and further away from my plan. I've had other people read this, but they're seeing things that I don't see, and they're not seeing stuff that I think is really clear. Lots of times they'll say, "This is like my 3rd, sometimes my 5th draft, but I keep making changes and it doesn't feel different." I've even had people give me their work and say, "I'm kind of bored and I'm tired of editing this, but I'm not really sure what to do next." And over the years working with these different authors, I love working with authors, but I know not everybody has the time and the budget to be able to work with somebody in collaboration to get their work where they want it to be. So, empowering authors to have the tools to do the editing themselves, or at least most of the editing themselves, is something that I'm really passionate about. So, as I was kind of thinking about all the things people tell me is hard and difficult about self editing, I kind of boiled it down into two different categories. The first category being I wrote it, so I don't understand why people don't see what I'm seeing. And then the other part of it is okay, I can see that there's a problem here, but I just don't know how to fix it. So, what we're going to do today is we're going to talk a little bit about the mindset that we need to self edit, and we're also going to talk about what you can do to build and develop your skills as a self editor. I'm going to hopefully give you some tools today that you can take away and actually start digging deep into your own work. So you start making changes that actually feel really substantial so that you can use another editor or a beta reader in a place where you've got your work to a much more polished level because you feel empowered to make changes by yourself. Before we get into those really specific things, I want to talk a little bit about this process of learning to self edit because it's very similar to probably when you started authoring, but it's always good to be reminded of these things. So, the first thing about learning to self edit is you have to commit to practicing. I know a lot of authors are like, I don't really like the editing process because it doesn't feel creative, it doesn't feel new. But if you're self editing, the editing process can actually be just as creative, if not more creative, than writing for the first time. But the difference is you were willing to put in the time and the effort and energy to grow your skills and grow the joy in authoring that maybe you haven't put that time in into editing. And just like you probably had to spend a lot of time practicing writing prose or practicing writing dialogue or practicing writing descriptions or practicing creating a really big moment in the plot. And the first couple of times you went through that, it wasn't as successful as it is for you maybe now. That's the same kind of commitment you need to put into the self editing. The next part about self editing is to plan constructively. And this is one of those places where I always tell authors to please do as I say and not as I do, because I've been editing for a really long time now. So when I start to see opportunities, I like to start giving ideas right away. But I'm not the author, I'm the editor. So giving ideas is really good, but actually making changes before you've gotten all the way to the end of your piece can actually be a little bit counterproductive. So when you're learning to self edit, this idea of like sitting on your hands or turning your keyboard off so you can't actually make changes until you've created a really constructive plan for what you're going to do with your edits so that you are able to focus on moving forward without dwelling on where you are right here because where you are right here in the moment might not actually need to change because something else later might make the change that you make now obsolete, or you may decide to move and organize things. And so, all of that to say, really long way around to say, plan constructively when you're learning to self edit. It's gonna save you a lot of time in the long run. The next thing that we want to talk about is embracing change. Now, the whole editing process is about change, right? Otherwise, we would just write a first draft and everything would just go out in first draft form. We need to really embrace change, but not just changing our work, but changing our ideas about what editing is and what editing means. Because by letting go of those older ideas, we make room for new ideas and new skills and new opportunities for us. And that can be something as simple as waiting until you finish reading your scene before you make changes, or it can be something as big as I'm going to change the plot of the plot point in this scene, and it's going to change the trajectory of my story. So just make sure that you're feeling um, open and excited about change. The last three things that I encourage people to do while they're self editing are things about their attitude. The first one is be patient. Writing is a long process. And a lot of the things that you're going to hear me say today are all about slowing the process down and taking your time. And most of us want to get to the end. We want to get polished. We want to do it. It's taken us however long it's taken us to write our book, whether it's a month or 3 months or 3 years or a decade, right? We're all in a different place in the process. And then to hear an editor say, it's okay, you can slow down a little bit. It's going to help you get where you need to be. Just practice a little bit more. It's going to be fine, can feel a little bit frustrating. I know that, I understand that. But I promise you, the more time you spend practicing these skills, the faster your editing will go, but also the faster your writing will go. Because some of the techniques that you pick up through the self editing process are actually going to make you think about and plan for and even write your story a little bit differently. So it's one of those things about like using patience now is kind of investing in your author skill later. Again, this is one of those places where please do as I say and not as I do, because I am an extremely impatient person and I just want to get to the end. It's all about the destination for me and not the journey. But I have learned over the years as I've grown my own editing skills that really taking the time to practice the skills becomes really important. The next attitude that I think is really important to have when you're self editing is to be honest about yourself and about your work. You need to look at your work with a critical eye, but it's also important to find honestly the things that are going well with your story and the places that need work. Sometimes we work with authors who give us a scene and they're like, "Ugh, there's nothing good in here. I feel like I should just throw it away and start again." And then when we start reading it, there's actually some wonderful things in there, but they can't see it for the frustration. And then, of course, we work with authors on the other side of the spectrum that are like, this is perfect, but I think there needs to be a little bit of grammar editing. And then, as a reader who doesn't have the whole story in the back of their mind, we don't understand it as clearly as the author does. So, just being able to find the honest evaluation of your work can be really hard. Some of us are going to be really critical of ourselves, and some people are going to be really proud of their work and have a harder time finding the stuff that needs to be changed. So just be honest with yourself about what type of evaluator you are, but then try to use that knowledge to be able to evaluate your piece honestly. And then the last thing that I think is really important is be kind to yourself when you're giving yourself feedback. Often we work with editors who spend a lot of time practicing their craft of giving feedback to other people. And they really like to start, myself included, start with a place of strength and then use that strength within the piece and within the author style to permeate through the rest of the piece to take the things that aren't working as well and leaning on those really good skill sets. When we're giving ourself feedback, we sometimes aren't as nice to ourselves as we are to other people. So I just want us all to take a minute and think about when we're self editing, being as kind to ourselves as we would be if we were reading somebody else's work. Again, not to the place where we're not being honest, but just making sure that we're making a really concerted effort to do what's best for ourselves and take care of ourselves, because that makes all of these other things we talked about committing to practice, planning constructively, embracing change, being patient, and being honest, all worthwhile. Because if we're just mad at ourselves, it's hard to be honest and patient and embrace change and plan constructively and commit to practice. So, those are some attitude things that I think are important as you're learning self editing. Now, let's talk a little bit about what editing looks like and what it means in a general sense so that we can then start talking about it from the perspective of self editing. And as we do this, we're going to talk about the roles in editing. Our role as the author, the reader's role in the process, and a editor's role. And when I say reader, I don't necessarily mean beta reader. I mean your final, once you're published reader, though beta readers often play a good substitute for that. Then we're going to talk a little bit about mindset. Mindset here is a little bit different than the attitudes that we just talked about, though you are going to hear a lot of overlap, especially in the embracing change area. But the idea of the mindset is, as you're going through the roles as a self editor, how do you have to put your mind in the space that it needs to do the job that it's set up to do in that moment? The next thing we'll do is we'll talk a little bit about the process of editing, specifically the self editing process. And this is the place where hopefully you'll have the most tangible skills to be able to take away from this webinar and be able to actually start applying things to your own writing. And then the last thing that I want to do as we wrap up is talk about the types of editing. And when I say types of editing, I don't mean like a developmental edit versus a line edit versus a copy edit. I mean, when you're actually getting in to make changes, what kind of changes should you be focusing on? Because if you remember when we were talking about all the different things people say about why it's so hard to make impactful changes in their own work, a lot of times it comes that they're trying to actually make the wrong kinds of changes at the wrong time. So if you can identify what kind of changes your scene needs, then you'll be better equipped to be able to make those changes. So I'm going to take 1 second pause here and just look at the chat here and ask the moderators if there is anything that came up in the chat that needs to be answered before I move forward. I am really going to enjoy going back and reading all of these comments. Unfortunately, I can't read and type at the same time. Okay. Do you recommend resting a story before you begin the self editing process? Yes, absolutely. We are going to talk about that when we get into the mindset part about how you're going to set your mind to be able to do the roles. I love that question. Thanks so much for asking that. Um, Yes, the types of editing, I do like to think that the dialogue doctor, while we do subscribe to the need for developmental editing, copy editing, and proofreading, um, once you're in that developmental editing stage, knowing that not all developmental editing is the same, I think is an important thing. So yeah, wouldn't say it's necessarily a new mindset, but it just adds a different layer or different subsets to something that you're probably already doing. Well, great. Um, Thank you for those questions. They were fantastic. Let's go on and talk a little bit about roles, and um, then we can jump into more questions as necessary. Okay, so in a traditional editing situation, you have the writer, that's you, who is in charge of creating the content. Authors are amazing and they're so creative, and you all are able to create entire worlds, new people, and often new situations and scenarios. And you're so creative, and that's your job, right? You're supposed to come up with something that nobody has ever seen before. I love that. Then you have your editor, whose responsibility it is to ensure that all of your vision as the writer comes across on the page. Because when your reader gets your book, their job is to just enjoy the content, right? They're supposed to pick up the book and they're supposed to connect with your story or connect with your character in whatever way you, as the author, identified that that's supposed to happen. The process that this usually goes through is you write something. Maybe you self-edit it a little bit. You give it to your editor. They give you some notes back. You take the notes, you ask some questions, you make some changes, you send it back to the editor. At some point, you and the editor agree that it's good to go, and then it gets published. And then a reader picks it up and really has no idea what work you and the editor did to make this happen. I remember as a kid, I used to read so many books, and I used to think that authors were just these amazing, miraculous people that just were fantastic storytellers. I had no idea that editors were actually a thing until I started learning more about what writing was like. And often, while writers have these great ideas, sometimes it's hard to create something in a vacuum. So, having an editor who's going to help you understand how other people are seeing your vision can be really helpful. But in this traditional editing system, the fact that there's a writer, an editor, and a reader as three separate pieces means that the process goes back and forth until it's finalized, and then it can go out into the reader. It also means that as a writer, you only have to have the writer's mindset, because your editor is playing the role not just of the editor, but also as the reader who doesn't know everything that's going on in your story. If you have an editor that you're working with long term and they're collaborating with you, they should be able to catch hold of your vision. And when you write something that doesn't align with your initial vision, they can bring it to your attention so you can decide if the vision needs to change or the work needs to change. But having that collaborator, that partner, means that you as a writer can silo your mindset into just being a writer. There's a lot of freedom to that. It also means that when you're editing, oftentimes, even when you're reading it, you're still thinking about the piece as a writer. Or when you're editing, you're still thinking about the piece as a writer and what your goals are, because you don't actually have to shift that mindset in a traditional editing relationship. Also, lots of times in the traditional editing relationship, your editor will just make changes based off of the type of edit that you need. If you've got a good developmental editor, if they're seeing a place where you can boost the emotional intensity of the scene, they're just going to suggest edits that boost the emotional intensity with or without telling you, hey, you need to work on emotional intensity here. If there's a place in the story where your character's choice feels pretty easy, but in the story arc, it feels like it should be more of a challenge, they may just offer you suggestions for how to build the tension in that character choice, but they may not tell you, hey, I think you really need to focus on the character's growth arc here and making these choices more difficult, because often an editor is focusing on time and getting you your story where it needs to be. But by siloing these roles and responsibilities, as the writer, you're relying on other people to identify the type of edits that you need. So, as we start looking at that, we create this challenge. These roles are blended. You already know the vision of your story, so you don't really have to think like an editor. You already know what you want your story to look and feel like, and it's a labor of love for you. You've put so much time and effort and energy into it, it's hard to see it for anything other than this labor of love. So, this creates a challenge because as the writer, you're now trying to be the editor and the reader. But the way that we fix that is we decouple the roles and the responsibilities and we embrace the focus of each role. So when you're done writing and you decide that you're ready to edit, you turn that writer part of your brain off and you set it to the side and you say, I am going to be a reader now. And as we talk about mindset in a moment, we're going to talk about how you turn your brain from being a writer. You probably eat, sleep, and breathe writing. You probably think about your characters as you're driving or commuting to your work. You probably go out to dinner and talk about your characters and what they're doing in your book because they're that vivid to you, right? But you have to be able to push all of that aside and just read like a reader. We're going to talk about how to do that. And then once we've finished doing the read as a reader, we're going to then step back and look at, okay, this was my goal as the author. This is what I thought about the story as the reader. Now, how do I blend and balance between my vision and what the reader is experiencing? And that's what we're going to do as the editor. So, by really understanding that while I'm playing the role of the writer, the editor, and the reader, I'm going to take off one hat and put on another hat, if you like the changing hats metaphor. Okay, so let's talk about what that is from a mindset perspective. The first thing that we're going to do from a mindset perspective is we're going to understand how to view the piece that we're working on, not as an author. Okay. That means all the work that you've done, all the time, effort, and energy you've put into being an author, you have to put all of that aside and you have to pick up your story and just enjoy the read as if you went to your local bookstore and purchased your book off the shelf or bought it through your favorite e-reader software. Okay. Or got it from your library. Support your public libraries. Big fan. Okay. So, what does that mean? How do you understand your piece as a reader? The first thing that you have to remember is that while you have the ideas and the stories and the characters living in your head 24/7, you may as well have given your reader a blank journal to fill with your story. They might know something from your back cover blurb. They might know something because they watched a TikTok video about your book, or they might have been told by one of their friends. They might have some idea what your book is about, but they don't know your characters. They don't know your world. They don't know your story. And every word you put on the page is going to reveal a piece of that story to them. So, going into reading your story and trying to clear your mind of everything that you know and just read every single word one at a time off your page is going to help you see your story the way your reader sees your story. Because let's be honest, how many times when we're editing our own work, we start reading it and we're like, oh, yeah, I know what that paragraph says. And you just skip ahead a little bit. Most of us don't even know we're doing it. We don't mean to do it. We just skip ahead because we think we know what's there. Your readers can't always do that. So, focusing word at a time, phrase at a time, is really going to help you change your mindset from being an author to being a reader. The next thing that you can do to help make that switch is to trick your brain. Our brains are amazing. They can do a million things at a time. I mean, right, we're all sitting here engaging with each other and this content, and we're still breathing and our muscles are still moving, and we're not even thinking about those things. Our brains are amazing. But if you've ever seen a magic trick, you know our brains are fickle and they can be tricked pretty easily, right? A little sleight of hand, and oh my gosh, our brains don't know what to do with it. We're going to use that and we're going to leverage that to be able to help us turn off that author part of our brain and start thinking about it as a writer. So, the first thing, and someone put this in the chat earlier, thank you so much. Leaving time between writing and reading and the editing process is one of the best ways to get yourself out of the author mindset and into the reader mindset. That I always recommend that whenever possible. But that's not always possible, right? We're on deadlines. We only have a certain amount of time to work on our story. Whatever it is, we might not have time. So if you don't have time, try using the verbalization trick. Our brains, I'm not a brain scientist, so if you know more about the brain than I do, and this is incorrect, please throw it in the chat. I'm going to be really excited to read and learn more about that. But our brain processes information differently when we hear it than when we read it. So using your text to speech function on your computer or your tablet or your phone so that you're listening to the story versus reading it is going to help you get out of your author mindset. If you don't like or don't have that feature, read it aloud to yourself. Or if you have a friend or a family member, or you're willing to just ask a stranger, have someone else read you the story. Because again, hearing it is going to feel a little bit different. If hearing it or reading it out loud to yourself feels a little bit weird or uncomfortable, that's okay. You can always change the format or change your location to do that kind of sleight of hand thing to trick your brain. If you usually type your story on the computer or a tablet or whatever, try printing it out and reading it from the physical print. Um, Change your font size, change your color, change your font style, just to help your brain think about it differently than what you see every time you author. The other thing I recommend is changing your physical location. Most of us who are in the authoring community, we also read for enjoyment as well as we read to learn. Think about the difference in your body position and your body location when you read for enjoyment than when you author. When I'm working on writing stuff, I usually sit at my desk or I go to a coffee shop and I try to use like good posture and all of that. But when I'm reading for fun, I like to curl up in bed or I like to curl up on the couch and right like I don't the last thing I want to think about is my posture. So when I'm trying to better understand something that I've written that isn't from the position of me as a writer, I try to use that physical body language, excuse me, that physical body position and location to trick my brain into thinking, hey, you didn't work on this for hours and hours and hours and all of that, and just read it as a reader. So, those are some tricks for understanding your piece and getting your mindset into being a reader and then into an editor. The next part of mindset that we want to talk about is when we're making changes, we need to think about the changes as an editor, not as a writer. Okay. And the way I like to talk about this is writing builds the house. It creates the structure, it creates the rooms, it decides where the plumbing is going to go. But editing is what makes that house livable. It's what makes it a home, it's what makes it comfortable. So when we are editing, after we've done our reading and we've moved away from our authoring brain, we need to be strategic about the changes we're going to make. I talked about this a little bit before, but I think it bears repeating. Read everything first and try not to make changes while you're reading, right? Like, how many times are we reading something and we're like, oh, I'm just going to change that. Oh, I don't really like that word. Let me just get in there and change that. The minute you start changing things, your brain has now moved away from reader or editor and has gone back to author. Okay. So, to preserve the mindset of being a reader and then being an editor, try not to make those changes. Make all the notes you want, highlight, use post-its, put it in the margin, use a scrap sheet of paper, whatever it's going to be to mark down that you saw something or read something there that you want to change, but you don't want to actually make the changes when you're reading. The next part of being strategic is knowing what you're editing for. We're going to get into this a lot more when we start talking about type, but I mentioned a little bit ago the idea that do I want my reader to feel really emotional right here? If so, I need to edit emotionally. If I need this to be a big character moment, I need to edit for the character's choice. both of those things look different, then I'm trying to establish a new problem, a new place, or a new system. Special systems happen a lot, especially when we're talking in sci-fi, where there's like a new world or there's a new government, and we have to explain things like that. Those systems need to be described. Those types of changes are going to look different than the emotional changes and the choice changes. So knowing what you're editing for is going to be a big part of the mindset when you're making the changes. And then when you're making your plan, because remember I said, read without actually making the changes, make your notes. Once you have all your notes, you're going to create a plan. And that plan should work big to small. We shouldn't be making our spelling and grammar changes before we make our structural changes, because then those spelling and grammar changes might not actually be effective. This goes back a lot to that quote that people say, this is my third edit and I don't really feel like I'm making significant changes. Often it's because we're focusing on the small changes and we're missing the big changes. So planning big to small. The last thing about making changes mindset, I think it's really important for us to think about as authors, is being bold. Often we put so much effort and so much energy and so much planning or so much time into what we've written, we're afraid to make changes, because if I make a change here, that section that I really love later might not fit or it might not work. But being open to all the possibilities, even if that thing we love doesn't work, means that we have more opportunities to make it better than if we hold off to try to preserve one thing that we love. As you're looking at all the possibilities, try writing the changes outside the piece. Okay. We talked about time a lot in the beginning, and it takes a lot of time to edit, and we just want to often get through it because we have another chapter to write. So we just want to make one change and be done with it. But sometimes the one thing that we think might happen might not be the best. So we might have to write a page once and then, well, maybe if I do it this way and then draft it again. And maybe it's not a whole page, maybe it's just a paragraph or, two or three paragraphs. But trying it one or two ways outside the piece gives you the opportunity to say, oh, you know what, my first one wasn't great and my third one wasn't great, but that second one, that has all the elements that I want. When I'm ready to execute my plan, I can just take that one and just plop it into the edits. So doing those things outside gives you more opportunities to see and be open to all of those possibilities. And the last thing about being bold means that sometimes you have to change your plan or your vision. When you're working with an outside editor, they're going to be challenging your plans because they haven't been thinking about this story arc 24/7. If you've got a good editor, they are thinking about your story beyond when they're just working on it, but they're not living with it the way that you're living with it. So they are able to see the story from a little bit different light than you have. So they're going to challenge you a little bit. Being able to challenge your own plans by yourself is a really bold mindset shift that's really going to help you in the self-editing process. Instead of going, no, I wrote that, I like it, it's good enough. Really be bold and challenge those plans. All right, we talked a lot about the mindset. Let's talk about the process. At the Dialogue Doctor, we came up with this 7-step process called Hire Casey. It's intended to have 4 steps that help you understand the piece and 3 steps really focused on making and finalizing your changes. If you are in a place where you are really struggling to make effective changes to your piece, our recommendation is to do each one of these steps individually. Read your whole piece doing the highlights, read your whole piece doing the reviews, which together make the higher part. Do the whole piece with compare, do the whole piece with align, do the whole piece with strategize, do the whole piece with edit, and do the whole piece with yo-yo. Most of us don't have that kind of time. So if you don't have that kind of time, it's okay to do all four of the understanding the piece steps in one or two passes, and then create your strategy, make your edits, and then review them. That will save you some time. But if you are really committed to learning how to self edit, taking a piece and giving yourself a space of time where you're really just going to hone in on each one of these steps independently would be the equivalent of going to batting practice before a big baseball game. And all you're doing is practicing your swing to hit the ball over and over and over and over and over again. So when you get into the game, in this case, when you're doing all four of the understanding the piece steps at one time, you have that muscle memory to be able to do it. So let's talk about what these steps are. What does hire Casey mean? Well, the first thing that you're going to do is reading like a reader. That means, again, putting aside everything that you know as an author, forget about your job as the editor to balance between the vision and the reader experience, and just think about this as you're enjoying it. Mark the important sections of your piece. Now, when I say important sections as an editor, I mean that almost every single word in your piece is important. Because remember how we talked about your reader doesn't have your vision, it's a blank page. But in the interest of time, highlighting things like new information that's helping the reader understand your characters, your problems, or your world. Elements that are choices that your character is making and what tension is happening to make those choices important and what the outcomes of those choices are. And then what your character's reactions to emotional triggers are. If you're doing the character's reactions, you're also probably going to want to highlight the triggers and the things that are making your character respond emotionally. So, after you've gone through and you've marked those important sections, you're going to think about the impact of how those highlighted phrases and words impacted you and why did they impact you. This made me feel something. This was confusing to me. Um, does this tie to something that happened in the past or will it tie in the future? Remembering highlight and review are all coming from the reader's perspective. After you've looked at the piece from the reader's perspective, you're going to compare that reader's perspective to your ideas and your vision as the author. This is where you get to put your author hat back on and you're going to think about what your vision is. So if you're reading as the reader and you think, oh, this is going to foreshadow something that happens in chapter 12 and you're only in chapter 3, that's a note you want to put in the margin as the author under compare. But then you have to take a step back and go, but as the reader, do I know that yet? If not, what am I seeing on the page based off of what's actually there and not what I know is coming? After you have your highlights and your reviews and your compares, then you're going to come in as the editor and you're going to identify those possibilities for change. You're going to look and you're going to say, as a reader, I can see how this piece was confusing because I don't have enough information. But as the author, I didn't want to give the entire story away, so I made it intentionally vague. As the editor, you're going to come in and go, okay, is the vagueness worth the confusion for a payoff that doesn't happen for another 10 chapters? Maybe, or maybe I can give a little bit of information, or maybe I can give a lot of information. And what are the impact of all those things? And remember, we talked about being bold and using extra paper or the margins to write down all the different ideas to do that brainstorming to figure out what it is that you want. After you've done the whole read, the whole scene from the reader's perspective, from your perspective as the author, and then from the perspective of the editor, you are ready to move past the understanding piece of the process of the hire Casey process. And that gets us through the hire Ka. And then we get into the C part. which is about making changes. We're going to create a strategy first. You spend all this time making all these efforts on making notes in the margin and figuring out what your options are. Now you're going to make a plan. You're going to look through it and you're going to be like, okay, I brainstormed this. I thought about what I could do here. This is what I decide I'm going to do. Maybe you drafted a couple different versions of the dialogue just to see what it could look like. Maybe you added prose in a place you didn't have prose. Maybe you took a paragraph of prose and created optional dialogue for it, whatever. You have all those little pieces. Now you're going to create a plan and you're going to work big to small. Because again, you don't want to be changing what is the saying? You don't want to rearrange chairs on the Titanic, right? Like work really big and then get to the place where you're ready to make those smaller changes. After you have a plan and a strategy, then you're actually going to start writing and making changes. And remember at the beginning, I told you this process is going to feel really, really long. I've been talking about this process for 10 minutes now. And now we're at a place where we can actually make changes. Some of you are probably thinking, I don't have time for that. I get it. Most of you will not need to go through this step by step by step by step process for every piece that you're doing. Once you start to get the idea that I have to think like a reader, I have to think like an editor, and I have to think like an author, and I can't do all of them from the author perspective. But while you're practicing, it's like I said, doing batting practice, and 2 hours of batting practice probably is going to impact your batting average. For anyone who likes baseball, if you don't, just ignore all of that and think of a new analogy for you. But it is a time consuming process. But by doing it step by step like this, you are actually going to make much more impactful changes. The last part of the process is yo-yoing, and it's called yo-yoing because you're going to go backward and then forward in the process as many times as you need to until you get it right. So when you read it, you're reading it, when you read your edited piece, you're going to read it like a reader. And then after you're done, you're going to look at your strategy. Did I hit everything in my strategy? Then you're going to go back through, align, compare, review, and highlight and make sure all of the notes that you spent all that time while you were understanding the piece to create, make sure that they're accounted for. If there's something that still isn't right, use the higher Casey process just to get that one section right. You don't have to go all the way back to the beginning. You can do just 100 or 200 words to be able to do that. Okay, so that's the higher Casey process. Yes, it's time consuming. Yes, it takes a lot, but the more often you do it, the less you have to think about doing it. The first time you do it, you're probably going to have to think about each step independently. But now, when I edit, I've been using this process for about 3 years now. Most of the time, I'm doing highlight, review, compare, and align all at one time. And then I can create my strategy and then go in and help with the edits. So, okay, last thing that we're going to talk about, and then we're going to take some questions. What are the types of edits there are in the developmental editing space? There are story edits, there are character edits, and there are emotional edits. Those are the big ones that every scene is probably only going to need one of these type of edits. Once you've done these big three, you probably need an artistry edit to increase your reader enjoyment, but that is more of a final line editing or proofreading edit. And a lot of times artistry can be folded into story, character, and emotion. Some people need it as a final pass through. Some people wrap it into story, character, and emotion. If you are doing a story edit, you are focusing on making the story easy to understand. These are the scenes where you're creating or establishing new challenges, new problems, new worlds, new systems. This is the place where you probably have a content heavy piece that doesn't have a lot of choice and it doesn't have a lot of emotion. Think about kind of an establishing scene here. Most of the edits here are probably going to be structural and have to do with the way you're organizing the piece. So you might have to take a step back and take the pieces of your scene apart and reorganize them so the story flows a little bit more easily. You might not need to do much beyond that, but what you want to do is you really want to, in this type of edit, you really want to make sure that your reader gets a good understanding of the story and the characters. The next type of edit are character edits. And this is the place where you want your reader to really understand who your character is, where they are growing, why they are growing, or why they're not growing, and helping them understand the choices that the characters make. How many times have you read a book or watched a show and a character did something on the screen and you look at the person you're watching TV with and you're like, what just happened? Why did that person just make that choice? That's the kind of scene that needs a character edit. If the choices are too easy, or if the choices are too hard, or if the choice is really hard and the character doesn't make a decision that matches with their background, you're going to want to focus your edits on the choices that the character is making. An emotional edit is when we want to craft the reader's journey. We want our readers to feel everything our characters are feeling and sometimes more. These are the places where you read it and it doesn't feel as powerful as you want it to feel. Focusing on the combination of triggers and character reactions are going to help in these emotional edits. You're going to look for all the things that are making your characters react, and those are the things where you're going to spend most of your time and your effort and your energy. Once you've done your story, your character, and your emotional edit, then you can look and decide if you need that artistry edit. But like I said, a lot of people can do an artistry edit in combination with the story, character, and the emotional edit. So let's talk some questions here. I gave you a lot of information in that 49 minutes. So I'm going to read through Six Cats. Thanks so much. I see some questions here. Beth Bliss says, you have one book published and you're asking for feedback and that gets you crickets. I'm sorry that happened. Putting in that much effort and energy and not getting feedback back can be really frustrating. Do you keep going making assumptions about what you want to convey and not worry about what readers are looking for? Um, this is a choice that you as the author get to make about why you're writing a story. If you are writing because it fills you with joy and you have all these stories that you want to tell and you don't care if anyone else in the world reads them or loves them, then you absolutely can go on making the assumption that whatever your readers are feeling is good enough. If you're the kind of author who wants to put pieces out into the world that really connects with your readers, then as you go through the editing process, focusing more on what the reader wants and less or what the reader is experiencing, and balancing that with what your goals as the author are going to get you the best results. But I can't tell you which of those mindsets is right. Everyone writes and authors and creates art for a different reason. You have to understand what your reasons are. I know it's a little bit of a philosophical answer. You have to decide what your goals are in writing and lean into that. If you want to connect with readers, you do have to, in the editing process, in my opinion, understand and take into consideration what the readers are experiencing. So, oh, and I see, Beth, you have another question here. So let me answer that. And then I will thank you for both of your questions. Is there a place where these graphics are available? Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize that the camera was covering that. Yes, I am sure that we can get you a copy of the slide deck. I will defer to the facilitators, the moderators in this on how to do that, and we will make sure that you get a copy of that. But thank you for your excitement and your engagement there. Um, any other questions that I missed there? Um, let's see. No, anyone? Does it help to get an AI narrator just for you to listen, not for publication? Um, I think this is a really great way to use AI, especially if you can find a narrator or an AI system that is economical for you. I personally think that there's something really different about listening to something, especially if you've written it yourself. You're going to hear things really differently. So I think that's a really smart idea. So whoever suggested that, thank you so much for that. I think it's a great idea. Um, all right. Anything else that I missed there? Okay. Again, thank you all so much. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. You have been a fantastic audience. Moderators and conference crew, thank you so much. You made this such an enjoyable experience, and I'm honored to do this. I hope I get to see you all next year. Take care.